Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, May 3rd, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. The U.S. is in talks on building military bases in Finland. So the US and Finland are working out a deal that would allow the US to establish a military presence in the Nordic country, as Helsinki is now a member of NATO. According to Newsweek, Finnish Foreign Ministry official McCaul confirmed the two nations are negotiating a defense cooperation agreement that may allow for the construction of significant military infrastructure on Finnish soil. The potential agreement would not include nuclear weapons, although Finnish officials have previously not ruled out hosting nukes. Currently, when it comes to U.S. nuclear weapons in Europe, there are U.S. nukes in 5 NATO countries under the nuclear sharing program, but none of them are countries that joined after the end of the Cold War. So Antel said that the potential deal between the US and Finland, quote, enables troops to enter the country, stay on the ground, the pre-storage of material, and possible infrastructure investments through the funds granted by the US Congress to the Pentagon, end quote. So the US and Finland have been in talks on this deal since last fall, and the discussions took place in Helsinki last week. So they were just held a new round of negotiations about it. It sounds like they're going to agree to something soon. This Finnish official said, quote, the agreement also defines the facilities and areas where the cooperation will be focused. They are basically military areas and garrisons. In principle, there can be more than one, but the discussions are still open in this regard, end quote. So this will give the U.S. Bases, they probably won't call them permanent bases, but bases, facilities that they can rotate troops through right on Russia's border. Finland shares an over 800-mile border with Russia, and its ascension into NATO means that this region is going to become further militarized. Russia already has plans to beef up their military presence in Western Russia near this huge border. And, they're going to respond. They said they'll respond. They'll take more steps depending on how NATO military infrastructure expands in Finland. So with a U.S. presence, I'm sure that they're going to take some more measures. And the U.S. is in talks with Sweden about a similar deal, although Sweden hasn't joined NATO yet. Turkey and Hungary are still holding off on approving them. But here we go, just more expansion and another country that the U.S. is pledging to defend. And this one, again, shares this huge, huge border with Russia. All right, the next one here, McCaul says that U.S. support hinges on Ukraine's counteroffensive. So this is Michael McCaul, the House Republican from Texas, who is the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He said on Monday that future U.S. support for Ukraine depends on Kiev's looming counteroffensive. So McCaul told Bloomberg, quote, I think there's going to be a lot riding on the line with this counteroffensive. If Ukraine is successful in the eyes of the American people and the world, I think it will be a game changer for continued support. If they are not, that will also have an impact in a negative way, end quote. So the U.S. has put an enormous weight on Kiev's expected counteroffensive and has helped Ukraine prepare for the assault by training soldiers and sending more arms. I believe those leaked Pentagon documents showed that Ukraine was raising 12 new brigades and of about 4,000 soldiers each, and 9 of those brigades were being trained by the U.S., and most of that training is going on in Germany. But leaked Pentagon documents and other media reports have also indicated that the U.S. does not expect Kiev to regain significant territory. So while preparing them for this offensive and putting all this importance on it, they actually don't think that they can gain much territory. McCaul said that he expects Ukraine to focus its counteroffensive on the land bridge that Russia has secured to Crimea. He said after Ukraine pushed back Russian forces, let's say the counteroffensive in that direction is successful, McCaul said Kiev could, quote, call for a ceasefire, after which We can then maybe have negotiations to finally resolve this, end quote. So McCaul has been a staunch supporter of Ukraine and has criticized President Biden for not providing Kiev with everything that it has asked for, including fighter jets and long range missiles. He wants them to use that stuff to target Crimea, despite the risk of escalation. And while there's a small faction among Republicans in Congress who oppose aid to Ukraine, overall, Republican leadership is still all in on funding the war. And that is what this next story here is. This is from Kelly Vlahos over at Responsible Statecraft. Speaker McCarthy drops a blank check for full support of Ukraine aid. So Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy used his trip to Israel to cast his full-throated support behind security aid to Ukraine months after insisting the country would not get a blank check from Congress. McCarthy said, responding to a question from a Russian reporter, quote, I vote for aid for Ukraine. I support aid for Ukraine. I do not support what your country has done to Ukraine. I do not support your killing of the children either. You should pull out, end quote. So talking to the Russian reporter like he's the Russian, like he's Putin himself. The video, I watched McCarthy kind of scold this Russian reporter. But yeah, he's totally, flip-flopped on this. And, it was always clear that he was always critical of the Biden administration, like McCaul, for not sending enough. So he said that blank check comment, before the election. He said, when the House Republicans take over, they're not going to want to write a blank check for Ukraine. But here you have him saying, no, we're all in. And I think Kelly was right to describe it as full-throated support. So who knows? I would expect pretty soon, maybe towards the end of this month or next month, to see the White House ask Congress for more, to authorize more aid. Because if they're spending things at the rate that they've been spending them, that the $45 billion aid package that was approved in December is likely going to be exhausted by the summer, if not sooner. All right, the next one here. This is from Declassified UK. Depleted uranium. Courts accept cancer risk denied by the British Army. So more than 300 Italian veterans who developed cancer after being exposed to depleted uranium ammunition have won court cases against Italy's military. Some of the cases were brought by their bereaved relatives. The judgments have mounted in recent years, with Italian courts repeatedly finding a link between cancer and service in the Balkans, where such weapons were fired. Although Italy does not have depleted uranium weapons in its own arsenal, Italian police and soldiers were deployed to Bosnia and Kosovo, where NATO allies fired the controversial ammunition. In the 1990s, depleted uranium is a chemically toxic and radioactive heavy metal produced as a waste from nuclear power plants. Britain used it to make armor-piercing tank shells, which are now being supplied to Ukraine. They're inside Ukraine. And scientific debate continues about depleted uranium's long-term risks to human health and the environment in post-conflict zones. British ministers insist it is low risk and that there is only some potential heavy metal contamination localized around the impact zone. And they go on to discuss the Balkans and Iraq, where the depleted uranium use is linked to cancer, lots of cancer, and in Iraq, lots of birth defects. And really the point of this article is saying, they talk about some other courts in other countries in Europe that have settled and acknowledged that cancer to these people that served in the military was related to depleted uranium, but the UK is denying that. And I believe that's also the US's, official position. They deny that the depleted uranium has caused all those horrible things in Iraq, and they're sending them to Ukraine. At least the UK is. The US might be too. They sent the Bradley fighting vehicles, which could use depleted uranium as well. But the White House, when asked if they were sending depleted uranium ammunition with the Bradleys, they refused to answer. All right, the next one here. Ukraine vows that it will not give up Bakhmut. So Ukraine's military on Tuesday vowed to continue defending Bakhmut, as Russian officials claim that Russian forces now control nearly 90% of the eastern Donbass city. So this is General Oleksandr Syrsky. He is the commander of Ukraine's ground forces, and he made this pledge while visiting troops on the front lines. He said, quote, "We will continue despite all the forecasts and advice to hold Bakhmut, destroying Wagner and other most combat capable units of the Russian army," end quote. After his trip to the front line, he said in a statement that, quote, "Together with the commanders, we have made a number of necessary decisions aimed at ensuring the effective defense and inflicting maximum losses on the enemy," end quote. So this vow came as Russian officials continue to claim gains in Bakhmut. They say that Russian forces control nearly 90% of the city. Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, on Tuesday, he said that they made some more gains in the city. They said that they advance up to 160 meters in various directions, which, it is there. It seems like they're taking the city, slowly, block by block, and the fighting is still continuing. And then, the Ukrainian officials justify staying in Bakhmut because they're saying that they're killing a lot of Russians. They're killing a lot of these Wagner guys. Because for a few months now, there's been signs that the U.S. and Germany and other Western countries have told Ukraine, the city's not worth defending, but they're saying that they're killing a lot of Russians. But a lot of Ukrainians are getting killed as well. And we know from Ukrainian soldiers speaking to the media that they've been sent into Bakhmut, what they call this meat grinder, with very little training, very little ammunition, and just very little support overall. So a lot of people, one Ukrainian officer that they talked to said that he was getting recruits that were afraid to fire their rifle because they were afraid of the sound, and they would just drop it and run. Just really horrific, things going on there. So the battle's still going, but who knows for how much longer. And I mentioned again in this, I know I discussed it yesterday too, that Zelensky has put a big symbolic weight onto the city of Bakhmut and said that if he gave it up, he would be pressured to compromise with Russia. But now they're talking more about this counteroffensive, which we'll get into in the next one here. So Ukraine says that it's waiting for better weather for the spring counteroffensive. So this is the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK. He told Sky News this on Tuesday. He said that heavy tanks that Ukraine received from its Western backers cannot move in the mud. He said, quote, "Obviously, the weather is not allowing so far the heavy tanks to move in the Ukrainian usual spring mud. So the weather is playing a key part. Then we're not telling them an exact day, an exact direction," end quote. So what he's saying there is they're not going to tell the Russians, say publicly their exact day and the exact direction that they're going to launch this counteroffensive. And one thing I didn't mention this, but Zelensky and some other Ukrainian officials said not that long ago that they can't launch a counteroffensive, that they don't have the resources, they don't have the weapons. So this could be they could be delaying it for other reasons than just this mud. But there is so much talk about it that I'm sure something's going to happen here. Prigozhin, the Wagner guy, he says he expects a counteroffensive to happen. And again, it's expected to focus on the southern areas that Russia controls, that land bridge to Crimea. If you're watching the video here, you can see this map from South Front. These lines have not changed in a long time. And we'll see what happens. A lot of people are ruling out the idea that Ukraine can make any gains at all. I know Russia has been reinforcing these lines quite a bit, but you never know what can happen. They might be able to break through in some parts, but who knows how successful it will be. But it just seems like it could really escalate things. If they do have success, it could really escalate Russia's bombings of the infrastructure and things like that. So we will see how it plays out. All right. I just should take this moment to mention again, it is our fundraiser. And the good news is that we have matching funds. So right now, a group of our generous friends has gotten together and raised $31,000 in matching donations to support antiwar.com. So we need to raise that $31,000 in individual donations to secure those funds. So this is a way that you can give to antiwar.com and double your impact. So you could go to antiwar.com/donate and see the ways that you can help us out. And again, as I always say, we're entirely reader funded. This is how we're able to do what we do and keep this non-interventionist, editorial line that we have. We don't receive money from corporations or anything like that. So go to antiwar.com/donate and see, PayPal, cryptocurrency. You could set up a monthly donation. And yeah, so please help us out so we could finish this fundraiser and just get focused on, what we do, which is providing you this news coverage and providing you with also the viewpoints from our great columnists and also collecting them from, other places to make this great page for you. Anyway, back to the news here. Where was I? Oh, this next one. This is pretty big. This is from Li Fang. This is his Substack. How the FBI helps Ukrainian intelligence hunt disinformation on social media. So he spoke with a Ukrainian intelligence official who's saying that they're pressuring the FBI. They're working with the FBI to censor what they call Russian disinformation on Facebook. So the Federal Bureau of Investigation pressures Facebook to take down alleged Russian disinformation at the behest of Ukrainian intelligence, according to a senior Ukrainian official who corresponds regularly with the FBI. The same official said that Ukrainian authorities define disinformation broadly, flagging many social media accounts and posts that he suggested may simply contradict the Ukrainian government's narrative. So this guy, just thought this wasn't a big deal, so he could just talk to a journalist about it. And his name is Ila Vitiuk. He's the head of the Department of Cyber Information Security in the Security Service of Ukraine. So he said, quote, once we have a trace or evidence of disinformation campaigns via Facebook or other resources that are from the US, we pass this information to the FBI along with writing directly to Facebook. We asked FBI for support to help us with Meta, to help us with others, and sometimes we get good results with that. We say, okay, this was the person who was probably Russia's influence, end quote. So now this quote is really something, how he says how they define what is Russian, so-called disinformation. So he says, quote, when people ask me, how do you differentiate whether it is fake or true? Indeed, it is very difficult in such an informational flow. I say everything that is against our country, consider it a fake, even if it's not. Right now, for our victory, it is important to have that kind of understanding, not to be fooled, end quote. So saying it, and that's the way a state treats wartime. They do everything, for victory, and they crack down on dissent and information. And so this is Ukraine, doing that with the FBI, and the FBI is working with them and helping them on censor things that Americans see on Facebook. And one thing that he mentions in the article is that recently Facebook censored, I think maybe they still are, I'm not sure, the Seymour Hersh report on Substack that he wrote, that his big bombshell allegation that President Biden ordered the bombing of the Nord Stream pipelines. So this could be a result of that. All right, so the next one here, the Kremlin says that U.S. casualty estimates are plucked from thin air. So the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said on Tuesday that U.S. estimates of Russian losses in Ukraine had no basis and were plucked from thin air. His comments came after the White House estimated Russia suffered 100,000 casualties over the last 5 months, including 20,000 killed. The White House offered no estimate on Ukrainian losses. Peskov said that the U.S. had no way to obtain the correct data on Russian casualties. The White House claimed about half of the casualties were fighters for the Wagner Group, which has been doing much of the fighting in Bakhmut. Both Russian and Ukraine have kept a very tight lid on their casualties in the war. Last fall, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, said both sides likely suffered over 100,000 casualties, but the numbers haven't been confirmed. So, it's really not clear what the casualties are. There's a lot of very different estimates being made by a lot of people. Which is strange, that we don't really know, and that the U.S. is kind of playing along and not even offering estimates on Ukrainian losses. In this case, at least, Milley did back in the fall, but this is the White House, and this was John Kirby, who is just really awful. But when those leaks, those documents allegedly leaked by Jack Teixeira, when they first gained public attention, there were slides from these Pentagon documents that had vastly different casualty estimates. One slide said that, Russian casualties were way lower than Ukrainian casualties. It said 16,000 to 17,000 Russian soldiers died, while as many as 71,000 Ukrainian soldiers were killed. But then U.S. officials claimed that this slide was altered on Russian Telegram channels. And then the other slide showed that the Pentagon estimated between 35 and 43,000 Russians were killed in action, and 15,000 to 17,000 Ukrainian troops were killed. So more Russians killed than Ukrainians in that one. I saw both versions. I don't know what's what. This is such a propaganda war, as demonstrated by that last article, that I can't really say. I know, I lean more towards higher Ukrainian casualties. But again, it's really tough to know because both sides are really just not telling us. And it's just, it's kind of a blackout on that information. All right, the next one here. The U.S. is frustrated with allies' refusal to enforce sanctions on Russia. And this is from Kyle Anzalone over at the Libertarian Institute. And Kyle writes, the White House is becoming frustrated with its partners in the Group of Seven and their refusal to commit to its economic war against Russia. After the invasion of Ukraine last year, President Joe Biden pledged to isolate Moscow and cripple the Russian economy. However, the Kremlin has found ample access to the world economy, including some of Washington's closest allies. So this is from a report from El Pais, and it says, quote, Russia has been able to find ways to circumvent the sanctions by importing and exporting goods via third countries. The United States wants to plug these holes with a total ban on exports to Russia, but the EU believes that this approach is not viable, end quote. So this is another report, another sign that the U.S. is really pushing this export ban, but it doesn't seem like it's going to happen. I mean, if the EU is against it, I'm guessing, and Japan, I know, is as well, that I doubt we'll see this announced at the G7 summit, which is going to be later this month in Japan. All right, the next one here. President Biden says that journalism is not a crime as he seeks the extradition of Julian Assange. So this was over the weekend. I'm a few days late with this, but I just saw it and just figured it was worth writing something up just to point out the blatant hypocrisy. And it's so obvious, this hypocrisy. And I think that's a big part of the reason why a lot of countries don't want to really go along with the U.S. anymore, especially with this team. They have Biden, Blinken, and Sullivan. They just seem to be just lying about everything. So this was Biden's speech at the White House Correspondents' Dinner over the weekend, and he declared that journalism is not a crime. And of course, this statement rings hollow as his Justice Department is seeking the extradition of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange for exposing U.S. war crimes for doing journalism. Biden opened his speech by discussing Evan Gershkovich, who's a reporter for the Wall Street Journal who was recently arrested in Russia. He also mentioned Austin Tice, who was an American that disappeared in Syria in 2012 while working as a freelance journalist. The U.S. says that the Syrian government is holding him, and Damascus denies that allegation. So who knows what the story is with that. I would think if Syria had Tice, they would try to use him as some sort of leverage to get something out of the U.S. But and another journalist that Biden did not mention besides Assange was Shireen Abu Akleh, who was a Palestinian-American journalist for Al Jazeera who was killed by Israeli forces in May 2022. She was gunned down when covering an Israeli raid in the West Bank, wearing a blue vest with big letters that said press on it. And there's been all sorts of investigations pointing to the fact that it looks like they intentionally shot her. But no, she didn't deserve a mention. Biden's speech came after a group of progressive Democrats, which was led by Rashida Tlaib, sent a letter to Attorney General Merrick Garland urging the Justice Department to drop the charges against Assange. And he faces up to 175 years in prison if convicted in the U.S. And so the charge stems from the leaks that he published that he got from Chelsea Manning about the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, the State Department cables, which he obtained, using standard journalistic practices. He didn't do anything different than, other media outlets have done when accepting leaks from whistleblowers. So that's why this sets such a dangerous, dangerous precedent. And this isn't just me saying it. The New York Times finally last fall, along with 4 other European newspapers that published things along with WikiLeaks, that worked with WikiLeaks, sent a letter to the Biden administration telling them to drop the charges because at least they realize If Assange is convicted, then we could be next. And that's the truth. That's exactly what this would set as a precedent. And, they sent that letter last fall. Assange has been in Belmarsh prison in London awaiting the extradition decision since April 2019. So over 3 years now. And where we're at, I think with the extradition is that they ruled that he could be extradited, and his team has appealed it, and now they're waiting on the decision for the appeal. So he's still there, still locked up in Belmarsh prison, and I don't think any of the journalists at this White House Correspondents' Dinner mentioned him or even thought about him while they were there. All right, the next one here: Israel carries out airstrikes on Gaza after rocket fire. So this is from Middle East Eye, and tensions flared today over the death of a Palestinian prisoner who was on a hunger strike in Israeli custody. After he died, fighters fired rockets from the besieged Gaza Strip, and Israel conducted airstrikes on the territory. And the man who died, Kadir Adnan, he was a 45-year-old prisoner, and he died nearly 3 months after being detained in the occupied West Bank. So that's not very long. The Israeli military first responded to the rocket strikes with tank fire. It followed up late Tuesday night, Israel time, conducting airstrikes on the Gaza Strip. The rocket attacks from Gaza were centered on the Israeli town of Surat, I probably said that wrong, and other areas close to the frontier with Gaza. Palestinian media outlets reported explosions on the northern region of Gaza, and there's been no casualties reported. So hopefully, things cool down. The last one here is from the New York Times, a brutal sex trade built for American soldiers. And it's about this sex trade in South Korea. After, I read this article much earlier today. I can't really give you a proper summary of it, but you should go check it out. It's about these what they call comfort women, that when people think of that in South Korea, they think of Japan, these women that were forced to have sex with Japanese imperial soldiers. Well, things like that continued after the World War II, after the Korean War. There's stories in here from the 70s and the 80s about American troops and these women that were sex workers, and the government of South Korea was involved. So it's pretty horrific stuff here to read, but it's definitely worth checking out if you have the time. But that is it for the news. Go check out our viewpoints. We have one from Ted Snyder: Russia's military performance doesn't match the propaganda. One from Elizabeth Voss over at Consortium News: using poison in Ukraine's depleted hope of victory. That's over at Consortium News. America's first Black president left a legacy of slavery. That's by Brian McGlinchey over at his Substack, and that's about Obama's disastrous intervention in Libya that gave rise to slave markets in the country. One from Brad Pierce over at his Substack, Cut My State into Pieces, and that's about Serbia and Kosovo and Vucic and how they are in talks, potentially in these they are in the EU-mediated talks to reach a deal. And it's about, the NATO intervention and how Serbs feel about Kosovo, which was carved out of Serbia when the U.S. and NATO broke up Yugoslavia in their interventions. So go check that out. And then our spotlight is from Blaze Malley over at Responsible Statecraft. In D.C., China is a 4-letter word and the excuse for everything. So that is important. And it's about Congress and just how, ridiculous all this rhetoric is, just completely out of control. And it says that lawmakers have introduced nearly 275 measures this session, while that mention China. I mean, it's out of control how just hysterical all these people are about China. I think it really shows how we are going down this path of confrontation. Like Chinese officials have said, it seems almost inevitable. But that's it. Again, help us out with our fundraiser. Go to antiwar.com/donate so we could wrap this thing up. Any amount helps. You could also tell your friends about antiwar.com, share this website around, share this show, like and subscribe and comment on YouTube and all that good stuff. But I'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.